everyone, Christina here. Welcome to day 17 of the holiday card series for 2015. Today I'm going to be using this stamp set from Tim Holtz and Stampers Anonymous. The stamp set is called Mini Weathered Winter, and it has a lot of these really pretty snowflakes in it. I thought the stamp set would be perfect for a technique that's been sort of in the back of my mind for quite some time now, and I haven't really had the chance to try it out until today. The technique I wanted to try is using watercolor paints, almost like an ink for stamping. I've done a similar technique with water-soluble oil pastels. However, I've never really tried it going straight to a watercolor medium. The palette I'm using today is from Kuretake Zig. This is the Gansai Tambi palette. And as I'm applying the watercolor pigment to the stamps, I'm making sure that the watercolor is not watered down very much. I want it to be fairly thick so that as I press down onto each of the stamps, a bunch of water doesn't go seeping out everywhere. I want it to pretty much keep the shape of the image that I'm stamping. I'm using two different colors on this large snowflake. I'm using a darker blue and then an aqua green, and I'm sort of mixing them in the center, making sure those colors blend a little bit. So I discovered that as I started stamping these images that they weren't as crisp and defined as I had hoped. So I almost scratched this project, but then I decided to go ahead and just take it all the way through, see what happened, and I actually discovered a really fun thing and a fun way to use this particular technique. So I will describe that to you when I get to that point. Since that large stamp was still wet with lots of watercolor after I stamped it the first time, I stamped it again the second time, and you can see how much pigment and water was still left on that stamp. I stamped some smaller snowflakes, and then I prepped a larger snowflake with those same two colors again, the aqua green and then the darker blue, and I blended them together on the stamp. I then stamped that in the top corner of the watercolor paper. Speaking of, the watercolor paper I'm using today is from Strathmore. This is the 140-pound cold press watercolor paper, and I've cut it down to be 4 1/4 inches by 5.5 inches. For right now, that's the size that it is, but I do eventually trim it down a little bit smaller than that. I used my heat tool to speed up the drying process. And then this is what I thought I would do to sort of salvage this project. You can sort of tell that they are snowflakes, but it wasn't really reading snowflake to me enough. So I decided that I would take the same images and stamp over the top in Versamark ink and then emboss the images with silver embossing powder. So now I'm using some detailed silver embossing powder from Ranger and just applying that to each of the snowflakes that I've stamped. And this is just going to give a little bit more definition to the snowflake shapes, but still allow some of that watercolor to peek through underneath all of that embossing powder. So I'm just applying that on and then shaking off the excess. I then used my heat tool to melt the embossing powder until it was smooth. And then this is where it kind of gets a little bit fun. I thought it would be kind of interesting to bring in a little bit more color in the background. So I thought I would just add a really, really watered down pale gray color. And I discovered that as I ran over some of the snowflake areas, that it started to pull up the color underneath. So that blue color and the aqua green color. I think it does that because there was so much of that color that it was applied down onto the cardstock, or there was so much of that paint on the stamp because I needed it to be really thick, that the paint was still just hovering on the surface of the paper, almost as if it was in that palette and the pigment had dried again and I could pick it up with my wet paintbrush. So I really loved how the color sort of started bleeding out from the snowflakes. It added to that kind of ethereal look of the entire piece. And I thought it was really, really fun. I think you could do this with a bunch of different images. You could do this with Christmas trees or hearts or anything that has quite a bit of detail. You could stamp it in watercolor, dry it, stamp it in Versamark and add embossing powder, and then run over the edges with a little bit of water, and it will let those colors seep out from underneath. I think it's kind of a cool look and very artistic and watercolory. I think it was fun. So after I painted all that, I hit that with my heat tool once again to speed up the drying process. And you'll notice that that joy area right there, I did paint that in. I didn't like how that looked, so I figured I would go ahead and just cover that up. So I'm going to use some navy blue cardstock from Basil, and I'm prepping that cardstock with an EK Success powder tool. This is just a powder that cuts down on any static cling and prevents embossing powder from being sticking to areas where there is not stamping. Then applied that same silver embossing powder and then hit that with my heat tool until it was melted. And I'll go ahead and set this aside for a minute while I work on the card base. The card base I'm using today is from Neenah. This is the color Solar White in the 110 pound version. And I've scored it at 5.5 to create a top folding card. I then put some foam adhesive on that watercolor piece after trimming it down to 4 inches wide by 5 1/4. Press that down onto the card base, and then I trimmed out that joy piece and adhered that down with some foam tape. I thought it needed one more element to make it look finished, so I'm using some chunky twine from Doodlebug. This twine is so beautiful, but you sort of have to have the right project for it. And I thought this silver twine would be perfect on this particular project. Now, if I had thought about the twine beforehand, I would have actually wrapped it around the watercolor piece before I adhered it to the card base. But I didn't think about it. It was an afterthought. And so I decided to just wrap it around the actual card front and kind of pull up that joy piece just enough so I could slide that twine underneath and then go ahead and tie that in a bow up near the top of the card. So I trimmed off the tails on that bow, and that finishes the card for today. So this is a really different looking card for me. It's a little bit more rustic, a little more distressed, definitely along those Tim Holtz lines, I think. Still really beautiful, and I really love how that technique turned out. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for watching until the very end of today's video. On screen are 6 more card videos for you to check out. They're from the 6 previous years of the Holiday Card Series, and they are all day 17, so I hope you'll check those out. You can catch me at my blog at kwarnerdesign.com, and I'm also on Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest, and Instagram. You can get those links down in the video description or over at my blog. Once again, thanks for watching, and I will catch you guys on Wednesday for a new video in the Holiday Card Series.